Good afternoon, everyone. In thinking about the last week or two, I was kind of thinking about what might be a catchy title for this afternoon's talk and how might I sum it up. Always when I'm coming to the end of doing therapy with some of my clients, I say, you know, if you're leaning over the bars on the landing in 2 years' time and somebody says to you, what did you get from that? How would you sum it up in a sentence or two? So I spoke to some colleagues and some people involved in kind of corporate issues, and they said to me, well, you know, a lot of today is about employability, about breaking down barriers. So a lot of people will be talking about employability, but actually what I want you to do is I want you to do things to make me redundant and to help get me the sack. And that's what I want to talk with you about a little bit today. So in doing that, that's not to say that I don't love my job. I'm 20 years working with people who either have experience of custody or are at risk of going into custody. 15 of those years with the prison service. And I honestly can stand here today and say I love my job as much today as I did on day one. But I do want to be made redundant, or at least have large parts of my role made redundant. Last year I had the privilege of traveling around the world a little bit and looking at different psychological societies, and we're all doing very similar stuff. Big data, disruptive technology is changing a lot of professions, including psychology. The availability of big data, psychologists, we always bang on about how we're evidence-informed practitioners, and the availability of big data in a way that it never was to us before has highlighted patterns to us, has evidenced things. So psychology has a lot more to say on a lot more topics in a lot more ways now than it had maybe when I first started in psychology 20 years ago. And that creates a choice for psychologists. Do we sit on the fence? Do we stay quiet and stay in our nice protected clinic rooms? Or do we actually give voice to what we're known? As far as I'm concerned, there's not much choice in that. To act with integrity, we have to open our mouths, which is part of the reason why I reluctantly agreed to the trauma of sitting here listening to other speakers before standing up today. So I am going to nip between the broader and then into the individual at times as well. I've been banned from using slides today, so I'm going to try and create some visuals for you to help us work through that over the next 10 minutes or so. So one thing I'd like you to do is just imagine that we're walking through the woods or Stephen's Green or somewhere, and you see a tree that's fallen over. And together we take one of those saws, I don't know what they're called, but those saws that have a handle on either end, and together we slice the tree open. And inside we look at it and we see lots of rings. So I want you to imagine that the person with experience of custody is in the middle of that. And that public policy, the culture and things like that are in the outer rings, and that their families, their workplaces, their friends are in the rings maybe closer to them. So at times we're going to go right in, and at times we're going to come right out. So to go right in to begin with, before coming here today, I spoke to a lot of the men I work with, and I said, you know, what do you want people to hear? There were some things I can't say, or at least not in the language that we both used, I'll be honest. But some of it was, one thing was about that, you know, make my role largely redundant. But what a lot of the men came up, a theme that thankfully was similar to some of the stuff I wanted to talk about, it makes my job here today easier, is that they wanted people to know that they do take responsibility for their offending, contrary to what we read in the media sometimes. But that people do generally take responsibility for their offending, that they are trying their best, even if their best is continuing to harm them at times, or possibly to continuing to harm someone else. So that was one message. And the other message, which kind of links in with it, is that they're not monsters, no more than you and I. These people are sons, fathers, brothers, colleagues, friends. So they're not monsters. Again, contrary to what we sometimes see in the media. So that was kind of a key message. I hope to kind of talk you through some of that stuff a little bit today. So what I'll do firstly is just talk a little bit about, you know, how do we get from a situation where some of the men I work with, where when we're like this, in our mother's arms, that we all look the same, and then we get to a position last week or this week where he's there and I'm here. I'm here as a psychologist who hasn't been in prison despite my penalty points, and he's here in prison for harmful behavior and possibly engaging in harmful behavior towards himself as well at times. So how does that difference occur? Well, one thing we know, there's a lot of branding going on in the world, and everything's about branding maybe these days, and psychology is vulnerable to that as well. But some of it I like, some I don't like, but some I like. And I love this idea of ACEs that some people might have heard of. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what we know is that these kind of experiences are, I mean, you can probably think of some off the top of your head. They're kind of maybe harmful things that happen to a child, like violence or sexual violence or verbal abuse. And they're also things that might go on in your household during your formative years. It might be, for example, the absence of a parent or parental separation. It might be domestic violence. It might be something like alcohol or substance misuse, or indeed having a parent who's incarcerated themselves. So that's ACEs. Bit of a head count. I'm guessing we've got more than 100 people here. We know, if anyone's good at percentages, we know that about 50% of people have no ACEs. We might consider them lucky or unlucky, but about 50%. So roughly about half of us, on average, about half of us here will have no ACEs. We know that the other half will have at least one. And we know that about 1 in 10 people, so I'm guessing that's probably about 15, 17 of us in this room, on average, will have 4 or more ACEs. So think about the 4 ACEs in a deck of cards. About 10% of us, and I include myself in this, will have 4 or more of those ACEs. Quite often people I work with in custody might have something like 7 or 8, unfortunately. So what does it mean to have 4 or more ACEs? It means, on average, you're 6 times more likely to contribute to or have an unwanted teenage pregnancy, 7 times more likely to have engaged in harmful behavior either toward yourself and or somebody else over the past 12 months, and 11 times more likely to have tried high-end drugs like heroin or ended up in custody. That's what having 4 ACEs means. A lot of people with 4+ ACEs don't end up as part of those statistics, and I include me in that. And we'll come to why that might be in a moment. So I hope you can begin to see that people who end up in custody may not be the 2-dimensional evil monsters that sometimes clickbait says they are. We can see that there's more going on. There's more in the narrative when we join the dots between what's happened at this stage in somebody's life and this stage when they're right in front of us. To dig around a little bit, not just this talk, but in creating policy papers in recent years, I can say, well, what's the evidence that actually, when we look at, if people are saying that people have personality traits of pure evil or that make them monsters, is there any evidence to support that, or is there any evidence to support something else? Because again, as a psychologist, I'm meant to be working in an evidence-based way. And what I found is there are 4, again, the magic 4 personality features, and only 4 personality features that are linked to harm. And I'm intellectually lazy. I've gotten through life being intellectually lazy. So if there's an easy way to remember something, I'll do it. And I come up with an acronym for those 4 things, and that's PAIN. So you think about the 4 ACEs, and you think about pain leading to violence. And those 4 things are, the first one, P, what is it? It's a paranoid cognitive style. That's really the way psychologists talk. So what's a paranoid cognitive style? That means I'm going through life keeping sketch. I'm going through life looking out for harm. So if I'm in a classroom and I've had a load of crap in my life as a child, when I hear a loud bang or a teacher roars because somebody's fallen asleep in the classroom, my brain starts thinking, is this a threat? Am I vulnerable here? Is something going to happen to me again? And I might get labeled with ADHD, or I might be labeled as having attention problems or being disruptive, but I'm doing my best to keep me safe in the moment. So a paranoid cognitive style might actually be part of the reason why I'm not already dead, why I've survived to this point in my life. It might have been adaptive in my hostile environment, in my hostile world. That's P. A. Affect regulation. How do I regulate my emotions? Well, again, if my parents, perhaps doing their best, but haven't been available enough, if I didn't get exposure to enough of the good stuff, or I got too much of the bad stuff growing up, I may not have had my emotions contained when I was a child and couldn't contain them myself, and I may not have learned how to self-regulate. There's times I don't self-regulate that well. You should have seen me there a couple of minutes ago. So, nobody's perfect, but we're talking about being good enough. So, and we're not here to blame parents or whatever, we're just talking about fact. So again, P, paranoia, affect regulation, problems regulating our emotions. The next one is I, impulsivity. Similar again, if I haven't learned to control my impulses, toilet training, eating the broccoli before the ice cream, the very small things as a kid that started off, if I've got problems controlling impulses, that's related to future violence and harm towards myself. The last one, the N, is a little bit more complicated, but stay with me. That's narcissism. And what's narcissism? Essentially, it's going through the world with a sense of entitlement, a sense that the world maybe owes me a living. If I got perhaps too much of the good stuff as a child, if I was overindulged, when I go into the world, I might end up that way. I might think the world owes me a living and I'm going to come into conflict with my world. Alternatively, another type of narcissism, a kind of a overcompensatory one, is where actually my self-esteem is in my boots and I don't really think I'm worth that much, but perhaps my way of coping with that is by overcompensating and pretending, trying to fake it till I make it in a way. And that kind of narcissism will also bring me into conflict with the world. So if you take nothing else from today, take that ACEs and pain are related to violence, not evil or monster. So that's the bad news. And before we talk about the good news, I'm going to depress you a little bit more. I'm going to talk about a couple of other little pieces of the bad news. We've kind of seen a little bit how early experiences can lead to harm and violence in adulthood. But it's not just in the one life. We also need to look across generations. For example, we know that about 1 in 4 young men, young boys in juvenile detention centres in the UK are or soon will be parents themselves. Again, international research comes up with a figure stating that about 60% of boys who experience having a parent in custody will end up in custody themselves. In the UK now, children with experience of parental incarceration, the percentages for that are approaching the similar percentages for experiencing parental separation and divorce. So it goes through generations. So throwing money into psychology to work in clinical settings will do a lot for the person in front of us, but it's not going to help the problem upstream. And our responses need to be upstream. So that's all the bad news. So what about the good news? What can we do upstream? The great news is that everything I've just spoken about, the difficulties we encounter from having 4 or more ACEs in our life, from having these pain factors that I've talked about, the things we need to do to challenge those and to minimize the impact of those are all learnable skills. And I think psychologists and probation officers and social workers, we're really sales agents for change. And I think it's fantastic to be able to stand here and say to people that all the crap stuff I've spoken about, there's fantastic hope. We can learn the skills to change this stuff. We need to be realists. I can't wipe out my ACEs, and I can't wipe out anyone else's. We can't whitewash our history. And I would argue, there's studies done to say lots of us in the caring professions have lots of these ACEs. That's probably why we come in here, and to give something back. So we can't wipe this stuff out, but what we can do is we can train ourselves up, we can reduce the impact. We even know, for example, research that looks at kids who've had lots of trauma. The 5 factors most associated with whether or not those children develop PTSD are not related to factors about the child, are not even related to factors about the trauma. They're related to what happens in the 5 to 6 weeks after the trauma happens. Because when kids get traumatized, they stop talking. And quite often, if your parents aren't coping as a kid, what do? You stay quiet, A, because you don't know what to do, but B, because you're trying to take care of your parents, because you can see them struggling and doing their best. So we need to get kids talking early after trauma, and we need to change cultures of silence. So, thinking of that tree trunk again, moving out into the broader picture, into policy. There's a lot of talk at the moment about post-traumatic growth, about how we can own the trauma that's happened to us and turn that around and create different narratives. I think Ireland is perhaps a uniquely placed country, given some of the traumas we've been through as a country, to actually engage in national post-traumatic growth. We have, in Small is Beautiful, I've been to some massive, huge psychological societies internationally in the last year or two. We can change. Change doesn't cost us so much in Ireland. We can pinch the evidence base from elsewhere, and we can be international, and we are international thought leaders once we own our own competence and our confidence. We can innovate. We can bring in what we call trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed public policy, and we can bring in trauma-informed services. So that might sound a bit wishy-washy. What are trauma-informed services? Well, consistency. So if somebody's accessing a service, they'll get hopefully the same professional, but somebody who knows their story, who can join the dots, who knows the piece from here through to here. And that they don't play the postcode lottery, that the service is available wherever you are in the country. They're kind of key pieces. Another piece is it's individualized. It takes account of the unique set of factors, and that care can be sequenced to address your needs in a logical way. When you look at a lot of this stuff, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect common sense. It's not that scary once you get your teeth into it. Some people here, and certainly when I talk to friends and family of mine, a question comes up, but what about the cost? That all sounds lovely, never going to happen. You know, who's going to put money into something like that? And rather than argue at a philosophical level, I try to stay in my psychologist head and hold my passion and channel that into, well, let's look at the evidence base for that as well. So what do we know about the cost? Well, we know if you're going to do this, if you're going to change to trauma-informed services, we reckon there's a cost. Huge, robust studies done in the UK, have shown it takes an extra about €830 per contact episode. So every time these individuals come into contact with our mental health services, it's going to cost about €830 more to provide trauma-informed care. So there is a small cost. What we do know, the average cost of a suicide or homicide in Ireland, in terms of social cost and economic cost, is almost 2 million. Population studies in the UK have estimated that having trauma-informed national policy that gets trauma-informed proofed, if you like, before it becomes policy, and implementing that will reduce the annual rates of violent incarceration by 50% and will reduce unplanned teenage pregnancy by 38 to 40%. Think about the cost savings there. So folks, that's the evidence base. I think it's a no-brainer, but it's not about what I think. So I'm not going to stand here and ask you to give people who've been in custody jobs. That's not my job. But what I am going to do is ask you to not dismiss people, to give people equal access of opportunity as after you leave here today. And I wouldn't be a psychologist if I just engaged in awareness raising, because psychologists, we always bang on about awareness is nothing without action. So what I'm asking each and every one of us here today to do, when you leave here, after the trauma of not having your mobile phone for however long we're here, when you do leave here this evening and you turn the phone on, before you check your messages or your social media or do whatever you have to do tonight as you race on, I'd ask you to just set an alarm for the same time, same day, next week. And I'd like you this evening, tonight, as you put your head on a pillow, to think about one thing, one realistic, one achievable thing you can do to start implementing trauma-informed change. Because if you don't, you're part of the reason why those violence and harm rates are staying artificially high, while we have artificially high rates of unplanned teenage pregnancies as well. We're either part of the solution or part of the problem. There is no fence to sit on here. So think of one thing you can do. And then when the alarm goes off next week, what I want you to do is commit. If you commit to doing it and you schedule that action, you're more likely to do it. So that's enough of me being a psychologist up here. Thank you.